Okay, I want to get going and continue to talk about depth psychology a little bit and a little bit about Freud and Jung. There's something missing from here. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry about that. Why is that not here? Hold on just a second. Okay. Sorry about that. This is what I want to talk about next. Okay, so I want to go a little more in depth with Freud, and then we'll switch our talk over to you, and we'll see how much we get done today, and then we'll switch over. Again, this is another view of Freud's office. In Freud's office, you'll notice, and you can't see it too well on the slide, there are all these little antiques and statues, antiquities. And these are things that Freud collected. Actually, maybe a little brighter outside. There, is that good? Can you guys see still? All these little antiquities and things that Freud collected. So one thing that you can think of Freud's, Freud had a big interest in archaeology. And one thing you can think of as Freud's psychology is sort of a form of archaeology of the mind, right? That he's dealt with, like, archaeologist goes to one of these places, they start digging in the ground, they find all these ancient things, and then they're able to sort of interpret what these things were, what they meant. And Freud develops a system of psychology that does the kind of the same thing, where you go in and you dig down in the mind and you find all these things come out and you're able to interpret those things. Now for Freud, what was going on here was that he was going into the unconscious, and the idea was that he was bringing up stuff from the unconscious for the person. But for Freud, the unconscious is private. And this nice quote here from Walter Benjamin: if the interior represents the universe for the private individual, within it he brings together distant places and past times. So within your own unconscious, you have in there past places, past events in your life, all sorts of stuff that are useful. You also have the reflections of the structure of your own biology. But fundamentally, this unconscious for Freud is private. Now, I jumped ahead, I already told you about this slide to a degree. The idea that within the unconscious individual, there is a source of psychic or life energy, if you want to call it that. And in Hinduism, we call it prana. Tibetan Buddhists call it lung. Taoism, we call this chi or ki. And in traditional Asian thought, these are thoughts sought in the interior world of the person, in the private world of the person. And they can be accessed through meditation and or special techniques. Okay? And in Western psychology, we have these fundamental drives that are similar to, in some ways, to these ideas from Asian thought. So this is another important thing that is shared in Freud's psychology and in Asian thought. And again, we have systems in Asian thought about how these are in the body and how they move through the body. And of course, we're going to talk about this later. This is a tantric painting here talking about chakras. And chakras are these energy centers in the body, and lots of interesting stuff about how this energy moves through the body. Anybody here ever practiced Kundalini yoga or went to yoga class and they said, today we're going to work on the second chakra, right? They were basically referring to this system of psychic energy, life energy in the body. And again, in Asian traditions, psychic energy, what's in the psyche or the brain or the mind, and what's in the body are not so separated. Okay, they're not so separated as they can become in the West. And again, if you take a close reading of Freud, you'll also see in Freudian psychology they're not as separated as you might think of it being the Western tradition. They're really intertwined with the body. And in Jungian psychology, there's a whole branch of Jungian psychology that looks at embodiment, embodied imagination, something I'm studying now, of how this energy gets attached to areas of the body and manifests in a physical way. So this distinction between body and mind is really not really there in Asian thought, and to some degree in Freud and Jung, much less of a distinction than you'll find in other Western psychologies or other Western systems. Now, let's talk about these things in Freud. These are written about in two ways in Freudian psychology. Unfortunately, both got translated into drives. Freud talked about instincts as biologically fixed and evolutionarily determined, and he also talked about drives, which are variable, insatiable, and a function of one's individual life history. In reality, in Freud, these are really quite mixed together, and when you read the translation of Freud from the German, these ideas are mixed together. So what you guys need to worry about, you don't really need to worry about this. To some degree, I'm going to use the idea of drive to represent both these ideas. That a drive can have both these things in it. Instinctively, biologically fixed, evolutionarily determined, and also something that is acted on and is mediated by a person's individual life history. So when we think about drives, you can kind of include both of these ideas in it. And it's really clearly difficult to distinguish between instincts and drives. And many Freud's followers and biographers found this out when they had to translate stuff and they weren't quite sure. It didn't really make sense. So I like to think about these things in terms of biology and evolution. I think at fundamental heart I'm an evolutionary psychologist. When I put my Western scientific hat on, I like evolutionary psychology, so I tend to think in terms of evolutionary psychology. What survival value did these things have, back in the day, that led them to persist in the population up until now? Okay. And the nice thing is we can talk about these things and we can see that survival value is really something that is pretty present in a lot of creatures, not just human beings. And we talk about these two. These are the ones that Freud came up with. The first one is libidinal energy, libido. You may have heard this. This is sexual energy, also called eros. Erotic, possessive, unifying, the pleasure principle, right? And this is something that has to do evolutionarily about sexual reproduction. That sexual reproduction has advantages over non-sexual reproduction. Non-sexual reproduction, I just bud off a part of me and eventually it gets big enough and it breaks off and it's a clone of me and it just goes over there and grows, and then eventually something will bud off of it. And we still have very small, mostly unicellular creatures that reproduce this way, and that's a viable way of reproduction. However, what happens with this kind of reproduction is you don't get two things. You don't get gene mixing, and you don't get as much mutation rate. And of course, evolution proceeds by mutations, random mutations that then get selected for. And again, we don't have time in this class to talk to you about evolutionary biology. I would encourage all of you to take a class in evolutionary biology. It is my opinion, and unfortunately only my opinion, that this is a big lack in the psychology program. You don't learn about genetics, you don't learn about evolution. I think you should learn about these things. These are hugely important in psychology nowadays, but it's not a requirement. And were I doing the program over again, if I could go back in time to when we started the university and we were developing the program, I probably would have pushed to add those things in there, at least as part of another class. But that be as may, you're going to get a little bit in here. So non-sexual reproduction doesn't lead to as many mutations, and it doesn't have as much gene mixing. Sexual reproduction comes along in biology and is very successful because it leads to both those things. You diversify the genes, you mix them around a lot more, and you have a lot more chances because of that for random mutations, which then can be selected for because they have some kind of survival advantage. Okay? Human beings, as you hopefully know, we reproduce sexually. And one of the reasons we reproduce sexually is because we tend to, in the best case scenario, we tend to find sex to be pleasurable. And we tend to find sex to be pleasurable. If sex was not pleasurable, we probably wouldn't do it as much. And so those creatures back in the day who found sex to be pleasurable tended to do it more, and they tended to leave more offspring. And so we've inherited that characteristic that sex tends to be pleasurable for us, tends to feel good. Okay? Tends to produce all sorts of things. You could even make the claim, as people have, that this is the reason why we have orgasms, because that's something that we like. And of course, as you know from your basic behaviorism, things that feel good, we tend to do them more often. Something's reinforced, we tend to do it, and if something's not reinforced, we tend not to do it. So when you have a self-built-in reinforcing mechanism, we tend to want to do these things. They tend to feel good. So Freud talked about this as eros, this underlying pleasure principle that we seek, not just sexually though. You have to realize that eros gets expanded beyond just the purely sexual to anything that feels good. So things feel good, we tend to want to do them. Things do not feel good, we try to shy away from those things. And again, when he talks about child development and child sexual development, he's really not talking about children having adult genital sex. He's talking about where children feel pleasure in their bodies through their cycle, while they're growing up, as they're going through various developmental stages. So we know the first, what Freud would call erogenous zone for children is not the genitals, it's not genital sexuality like adults, it's with their mouth. They feel pleasure with the mouth because the mouth is what they use to suckle the breast, and the breast delivers milk, and milk makes them feel good. And so that's where the first oral stage is centered around the mouth, right? The eros is centered around the mouth, the libido is centered around the mouth, okay? And on and on and on and on. You can go up through the stages. And again, when you take Dr. Baker's personality theory class, he will go over detail in this for you. I think he'll also go in a lot of detail about this if he's teaching you developmental psychology. And you guys will learn that probably somewhere along the line here. So this is eros. Does that make sense? So, animals, and again, you see this not just in human beings, but you can even see this in bugs. If they have a drive to reproduce, they reproduce, and so therefore there's more of them. And if they didn't reproduce, they're not around anymore, and you're not seeing them. Okay? So this is a very important thing. Okay? The other one, it comes later in Freud's theory. It doesn't come right away. It starts with eros, but later on, some people think as a response to his break with Jung, from the criticism from Jung and from Jungians, he adds another one. And this is non-libidinal, non-sexual energy. He calls this thanatos, which really means, this is really the death drive. And it gets through a lot of twisted sort of Pretzely logic. Basically what this gets to be known as is a destructive or aggressive drive. This is aggression, okay? So again, we're not going to go into the Pretzel logic here of how sort of self-destructive drive turns into aggression, but it's easier probably for us to think about this as an aggressive drive, okay, an aggressive drive. And this makes sense evolutionarily, right? So if there is a bug, we have scorpions around here, right? Anybody run into scorpions in their house? Some places more than others. You're down in Agora or Calabasas, you may have scorpions in your house. If you go and you see a scorpion, you go, "Ay, yike, a scorpion." You go to step on it, right? What does that scorpion do?
It's going to try to protect itself.
That's right. It's going to try to protect itself. It can manifest thanatos. It can manifest as aggressive drive, right? Now, the scorpions that protect themselves, they probably have more offspring than the ones who don't protect themselves. The ones who don't protect themselves just get squashed and they're on their way. The ones who protect themselves evolve, and of course we know that they can also evolve defensive systems. Okay, scorpions have a stinger, very, very painful. And so those animals that can manifest this thanatos are ones who survive to pass on their characteristics. And so we see that animals have this aggressive drive. The other thing, what's aggression good for? Well, we don't know about this because we're hungry. We just go to Vaughn's and just go down the aisle and just grab something and buy it and eat it, right? But not too very long ago, if I were hungry, I wanted a steak, I would have to get my spear, my knife, my stick, my whatever it was, and go out and catch my lunch, right? Now, if I'm a mellow guy and I'm just all about the pleasure principle, I'm not going to be very good at going and getting my lunch, am I? I need a little aggression to get my lunch. I need a little aggression. I didn't go kill another animal, okay? Probably not just going to subdue it and eat it, though that does happen in the animal kingdom. But I have to go out and I have to be aggressive in order to survive. So aggression is very useful survival-wise. Useful for defense, and it's useful for predation, for getting the resources that I need, right? So aggression, also very important. So the animals that were able to be a little aggressive are the ones that survived, and the ones who didn't have as much aggression didn't produce as many offspring. So as human beings, way down the chain, we end up being the offspring of the offspring of the offspring of the offspring. How many, thousands and thousands of generations? We have an unconscious motivating principle of aggression that, again, for human beings may be expressed in certain very unique ways, but we have this too. And again, you see this in the smallest creature, okay? And again, aggression can take all sorts of forms. Okay, we see this in animals. There's a bug on the ground, and I try to squish it, it will probably try to defend itself. I mean, it'll probably try to run away too. Could also include running away in this. Okay, fight or flight, ability to have fight or flight mode. Okay, but you'll see this in the animal kingdom, throughout the animal kingdom. So these are very, very basic drives that Freud talked about. Hard to refute that these exist. And when you go into a class with some behaviorist or whatever, and they'll say, well, these are just learned, right? Well, I can pull out a cockroach and I can say, watch it reproduce and say, did the cockroach learn how to do that? No. These are very innate. Okay, and you see these in all strata of the animal kingdom. Some people now speculating you're seeing some of this among plants. I don't know. Maybe. Okay. Now, for human beings, Eros and Thanatos are characterized by this word ambivalence. And by ambivalent here, we mean they're often both present in the same behavior. And as we will see later on in Asian thought, these are also often present in the same symbolism. Okay? The symbolism that we'll see in Asian thought is often ambivalent, containing both Eros and Thanatos. It doesn't mean ambivalence in the sort of normal way we think about it. Ambivalence in that it's often both there. And I put my favorite picture up of the whole semester, which is Supergirl and Batgirl. Here you go. This is your idea here. Supergirl's getting Batgirl spanking. There's a little Thanatos there, a little aggression. But if you see Batgirl's face, she is obviously experiencing some pleasure from this. And Supergirl is being aggressive and being aggressive, but she's also experiencing pleasure. We can talk all about sadism and masochism, but for that you have to take my other class in the spring, Psych 473, shameless plug, bizarre behavior and culture-bound syndromes, and I will talk about in a lot of detail S&M practices. So something to look forward to for next semester. I invite you all to come and take that class, but for this class you're going to get Supergirl and Batgirl, and the idea that Eros and Thanatos are characterized by ambivalence. Now, Freud had a topological model of the psyche. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, about the sort of reality that we can't see. And he breaks it down fundamentally into conscious and unconscious. And then there's this sort of area in here, pre-conscious, non-conscious. And what happens is for Freud, both Eros and Thanatos these drives try to come to consciousness. And what does consciousness do with these drives? Great word. The R word. Repression. Represses these things, right? So I look around the room right now, and I notice I just happen to notice I do not see any active copulation going on. That doesn't count you guys in the back room if you're surfing porn on the internet back in the back row. But I see no active copulation. Well, you're laughing, but this has happened before. People in the back row surfing on porn. There's nobody in here doing sex right now, as far as I can tell. And I noticed that nobody is killing or beating up each other. Now, the question for you is, why is that the case? These are two things. We all have these urges, right? We all have these urges. We all want to do the sex because it feels good, right? And we may want to do a little aggression because, well, aggression can feel good too. Again, take the class and say it isn't masochism. But we want the aggression because the aggression is either protecting ourselves, perhaps from that person who's trying to have sex with us and we don't want it, or we want resources. You know, the guy next to you's got a nice fruit cup and he's eating it, looks really good, and you're really hungry, and so if you just punch him in the face, you could just take his fruit cup. Or I know somebody over there has got a cup of what looks like Starbucks coffee. You know, you're really running risk. I mean, if somebody needs that coffee, they're just going to punch you and take the coffee, right? But that's not happening. I see you have all these nice people sitting around you. They're not attacking you for your coffee. And good thing you're not sitting in the front row, right? Because I'm drinking tea, which is a lame excuse for coffee, right? So, I notice nobody's attacking you. So why is this? We can ask ourselves the question, why is this? I mean, there's obvious reasons, right? Yes?
You have morality?
Well, we have morality. Okay, you could say there's a morality, or there's laws. If you guys were to start beating each other up, or, you know, somebody would probably call the cops, and if you started having sex with each other, somebody would whip out their phone and you'd be on YouTube in 10 minutes, or, you know, wherever they would put you up, you know. Yeah, those are, I mean, those are sort of external reasons, yes.
Because you, like, tuck those instincts into the back of your mind to get
You
by your
repress
idea.
those things. You repress them, right? You repress them. Why do you repress them? That's a good question. There's a slide on this coming up. Yes?
Because of your superego and ego, I guess you'd say?
Yeah. Well, what's this ego that you speak of? What is that?
It's the learned normality, it's the norms of society.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Is it like a self-preservation thing?
It can be, your ego helps you to sort of negotiate through your life, right? Yeah.
Could it be kind of instinctual to like be part of a norm as like a pack kind of thing? Like
Yes, you could make the case for that. People have made that case, especially for primates. That if you just start, you know, if you're a primate and you try to have sex with another primate and you're low on the dominance hierarchy, the alpha animal may come down and knock some sense into you. Again, this is also one of the reasons why we tend to like to be conformists as human beings, right? So if you take my other class, take my Nazi Germany class, I'll talk to you about that, right? It's very easy for us to be brainwashed. And also the Psych 473. Why do we do so many bizarre behaviors in a group? Because it's really easy for us to go along with the group consensus, but there's an evolutionary pressure for that. Yeah, so that would be part of the answer. Okay. Yes?
I guess in a way it could be like a way of connecting, as weird as that sounds.
Yes, actually, that's going to get to the point I'm going to talk about in a minute. So that's a very good insight. That we connect in a way, we're able to do something called sublimate. In other words, as human beings, we can repress eros and thanatos. We can take that energy and we can channel it into something else that, in many cases, has to do with doing things with other people and creating things with other people in a constructive way. Okay? Freud called this sublimation. Okay, sublimation. And for Freud, this is where civilization comes from.
So how do you navigate, well, I'm gonna make this a reduction point, but the question you asked, why can't it just be my prefrontal cortex is activated, therefore my limbic system, my parasympathetic and my sympathetic nervous system, sex and aggression don't have to respond, there's nothing challenging that.
Yes, no, that's just the physiological way of expressing the same thing. And what do you have in your frontal cortex? You have inhibitory pathways, right? So you have actually built into your brain structure the capacity to do this, right? And you all know Freud started out as a neurologist. So this kind of stuff, though, obviously we've come a long way since Freud, but I mean, this is the idea. He thought this stuff would ultimately be found in the brain, and to some degree, some of that has been validated. But yes, absolutely, it's just a physiological way of expressing it. And again, why would you have that physiology? Because it confers a survival value. Okay, so again, it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. That these aren't just
biological inhibition and repression, there's some kind of like moral thing about repression that I don't
Yeah.
know if it.
There's been books written about this now. I'm not up on them completely, but people have talked about this sort of biological substrate of morality. And again, you can think about it that way. I mean, I don't want to go too astray on this, but you could think about what do we mean by morality, right? And I could be very postmodern with you and say, well, morality is dictated by those who are on top. You know, what's right is, you know, what the dominant group is able to dictate, right? If you're on the bottom, you may have a different viewpoint about that. But yes, I mean, you could make a case, and people have made a case for a biological basis of morality, especially for human beings. And if we had time to talk about evolution, we could talk about that. If we, maybe in other classes, you know, that's something I can go a little more into detail about that. But it's very interesting, very, very interesting idea. But yes, I think this is reflected in biology, and I think if Freud were alive today, he'd be very, very, very happy to see that, you know, that people are still thinking about that. Okay, so it's a good point that we're not just talking about, you know, I mean, a lot of Freudian stuff seems to sort of like out in the ozone somewhere, floating in this sort of world of ideas, but actually the idea here would be that, you know, there are biological substrates for this stuff. Again, this is a reason why I like to ground my Freudian psychology in evolutionary theory, because it brings that biological basis, that reality to it, that there's a reason for these things. It's just, oh, I just noticed this, and it exists out there floating around. No, there's a reason for these things. These are useful things, right? Now, as I mentioned before, and I don't have time to go into the complexity of this, I could make an argument for you of how Eros and Thanatos come together, and these result in our need for attachment. That these drives of Eros and Thanatos result in this need for attachment. Again, we're not going to go into that in this class, but if you want to think about that, that's an interesting idea. And I think, you know, comes out of these things. So these are, for Freud, these are the two basic things. Eros and Thanatos, they bring ideas to the conscious mind that are not acceptable, right? Not acceptable for people to be having sex in the middle of class here. So those things, those urges get repressed. Those repressed urges can then be sublimated into something more constructive. So maybe you're not having sex now, but instead what you're doing is you're taking that energy, you're sublimating it, channeling it into finishing your college education, working really hard on getting an A in my class so you can graduate here and get a good job or go to grad school or do whatever you want to do. You know, you've sublimated that energy, right? And so we do spend a lot of time sublimating things. The problem with that is that we don't do a perfect job of sublimation. Lots of the stuff leaks out, and we get all sorts of you know, Eros and Thanatos coming out in all sorts of inappropriate ways, and that creates a lot of problem in human society. And if you don't believe me, all you got to do is turn on the TV, you know, go online, look at the newspaper, and just look at what news is out there. And you'll see all sorts of issues with Eros and Thanatos out there every single day. People are doing all sorts of inappropriate sexual things with each other. People are hurting each other around the world at any one time. So our civilization, according to Freud, is a very thin veneer, right? The sublimation, a very thin veneer over these urges that sometimes come out in not so great ways, right? You guys been reading the thing about the Stanford guy who was raping this girl up in Stanford campus, and I guess they put him in jail for a couple months, and he just got out, and you know, so that, you know, and by the way, if you want to erode your repressive ability, one of the easiest ways to do it is to use alcohol, right? Alcohol, you know, again, if you want to talk about brain stuff, alcohol starts messing with these inhibitory things, and pretty soon you're doing all sorts of stuff. You're attacking a poor girl, you know, outside under a dumpster when she's passed out, and bad things start happening, okay? And again, that's a good example because in that unfortunate case, you see both Eros and Thanatos mixed together. And again, if you look around the world and you look at these things, you will see, and you know, some things may be more Thanatos than Eros, some things may be more Eros than Thanatos, but you'll see the ambivalence of these together, and you can see all the problems in the world, you know, as a result of these being appropriately or what's the word I'm trying to think? Not completely well sublimated. Okay, so again, just look at the paper if you don't believe me. I'm sure you'll find some wonderful news this morning. North Korea just exploded its 5th nuclear weapon. That ought to be a lack of sublimation that should be concerned for all of you. Or you could think of it as a negative sublimation. That's possible too, but it should be of concern to everybody, right? And mostly Thanatos, but it's Eros, right? It's a missile that's going up, very phallic, right? You know, there's an aspect, if you're a Freudian, there's an aspect of Eros in that too. Right? Kim Jong-un was getting his jollies shooting off missiles, right? I don't need to go into the symbolism of that too much, but you get the idea, right? All right, so another way Freudians look at the psyche is through a structural model. And this is that there's certain psychic structures that emerge out of these drives and this repression from conscious, unconscious. And there's 3 main ones: the ego, the id is the unconscious urges, and the superego. And the interesting about this that a lot of people don't typically realize is that parts of the ego and parts of the superego are unconscious. Okay? The unconscious just is not just id. It also includes parts of the ego and parts of the superego. Most of you, I assume, this morning drove into campus here, right? When you came to the corner, either that one or that one, as you're coming onto campus, there was a stop sign. I'm thinking most of you did not, when you came to that stop sign, go, oh, I see a stop sign. Oh, there's a stop sign. I better put my foot on the brake and slow down for that stop sign and stop at that stop sign. Why? Because if I don't, the car may blow through and T-bone me, and that would be bad, and I could not survive, and I need to survive. Survival is really important, so I need to do that. I'm guessing most of you did not have a conscious, that train of conscious thoughts when you drove in this morning. Most of you just came in, didn't even realize you were seeing the stop sign, put the brakes on, stopped, waited, and went, and didn't consciously think about it. Okay? And so that is, you can think of this as that's the part of the ego here that is unconscious. Your ego does stuff all the time as the executive functioner of your psyche. It's the thing that's keeping you alive, it's functioning, it's keeping you going, and you do a lot of things without thinking about them that have some sort of value in organizing your life, of keeping you alive, of helping you to get through the day. All the time you do this. So there's parts of ego are unconscious. Then you have the superego. And what's the superego? You guys know this, you've had Freud before. What's the superego? Yes?
Conscience.
The conscience. So what are you conscious of? What's the conscience of? Right or wrong, right? So superego is your sense of right or wrong. And these are values that you internalize from your parents at a very young age. And you see this, those of you who have kids, you see this in your children as they're growing up. Certain age, they get to be like 2 years old, 3 years old, and they've heard you now umpteen million times say, you know, don't stick your finger in the light socket. And so if they're hanging out by the light socket and their hands wandering around, they'll start to feel guilty, or they'll see another kid stick their finger in the light socket and they'll say, don't do that, that's bad, right? But kids do this very early on. They internalize what's right and what's wrong. This comes from the parents. And the superego also holds another idea, and that is of the ego ideal. That's sort of the ideal way to be, the ideal, that you strive for, right? So that's in the superego. A lot of that is unconscious, okay? You know, you're in let's say, think of a good example. Oh, you're at the Apple store. That's right, new iPhone just came out, right? You're at the Apple store. And there's an iPhone 7 just lying on the counter there. And you notice that all the salesmen have stepped out of the room, and perhaps there's a little blackout and all the power goes down for a second. There's an iPhone 7 there. And all you have to do is just to go, whoop, whoop, and walk out of the store, right? And let's say you have that thought, or let's say you don't have that thought. Let's just say, like, just look at it, and most of you, I'm going to guess, are not going to pocket that iPhone, right? That's an unconscious thing. You've internalized your superego, your sense of right or wrong. You don't need to think, there's an iPhone there, like, Now, if the thought does rise to the conscious, that iPhone, I could steal that. Probably immediately you're going to feel a little guilty, right? And guilt will come. I notice that, right? But most of you are just going to see it there and go, oh, yeah, I wouldn't think of stealing it, right? Now, you might be a little sociopathic. You might have some superego dysfunction, or you don't really have a conscience. This is one of the ideas about people who are psychopaths, don't have a conscience. And so you're just very opportunistic. As soon as you see that phone there and nobody's watching it, it goes in the pocket, right? But for most of us who are not psychopaths, we wouldn't steal it, right? Or you might do something and not even realize it, but then sort of feel guilty. Guilt feelings from this, but you don't even realize what's making you feel guilty. And that's the reason why, by the way, some people go into psychotherapy. Very good, right? Psychotherapy to help you with this. But this part of the superego is in the unconscious, not conscious of it. Now, this, in a way, is metaphorically similar. The structural model is very metaphorically similar to ideas in Asian thought and some symbolism in Asian thought. Yes?
Would psychopaths be that their ideal self is their shadow, and that's why it's that's why they do what they do?
Say that again.
Is in psychopaths, their ideal self is their shadow to be like worse than be more id a thought or something like that?
I would say no, but you could conceptualize it that way. I don't know. I would say no, because a psychopath is going to do whatever is good for them. If doing something good gives them something, gives them what they want, they're just as happy. If taking that iPhone and handing it to somebody gets them a bigger reward, they'll do that. You know, as where if you're just driven by the shadow, you sort of just want to do bad things, right? You want to do the opposite. So I would say on the top of my head, no, but that's an intriguing idea. And if we had a Jungian, I could ask a Jungian that. If I think about it, I'll ask a Jungian analyst about that. That's an interesting idea. But I would say on the top of my head, I would say no, it's different. Psychopaths, these are people who have some, their sense of self to some degree is not as integrated as you or I. And again, we're talking about psychopaths and psychopaths. People can have psychopathic characteristics and not be diagnosed as a full-blown psychopath, by the way, is now called antisocial personality disorder. So there's gradations of it, okay? We could talk about that because being a psychopath also can have survival value, right? And I talk about, take my 473 class, and I'll talk about psychopaths in that class, and we can go more into that. That's a very interesting discussion. This class, we're not going to really worry too much about psychopathy. It's not going to be a big theme in this class. Yes?
I think the Jungian Robert Johnson said where the dragons are, the gold is. I think it's very common that the shadow holds a lot of repressed emotions. So I would say that if it's true from a Jungian perspective, the shadow wouldn't be the basis of a sociopath.
Yeah, the sociopath is not repressing those emotions.
No.
They're just acting on whatever they immediately can get. And again, we could also look at the brain. In my other class, I actually will show pictures of the brains of psychopaths, and you can see, they're not, it's not activated in the same way. They're not repressing emotions. They're just acting because they're being selfish. What can I get out of it, right? They're just
biologically, the developmental stage in the first 5 years of marrying and learning empathy and stuff like that, you can make a narcissistic argument for the sociopath.
Sociopathy and narcissism are like peanut butter and jelly. And again, take my 473 class. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about this stuff. We got a nice discussion about this. This class, we're going to assume mostly people are not sociopaths. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So let's look at this. And that's why, by the way, in the spring semester, I teach bizarre behavior in Nazi Germany. So I'm just talking about psychopaths and weirdos the whole semester. This semester, I teach Asian thought in the Asian martial arts class because I want to get away from that stuff. Because you lecture and you study that stuff, and by the end of the spring semester, I'm just burnt to a crisp. I just can't deal. Oh God, the world's so horrible. I don't even want to go outside. So I teach this stuff because this is a little bit more. I can look at some of the good aspects of human beings and not just wallow in all the negative stuff. So we're going to probably stick to the more not nicer parts, but the more non-sociopathic parts of this semester. So let's look at this symbolism you can look at this as Freud's structural model, and here's some Asian symbolism. And this Asian symbolism is very much what you guys were just talking about here, right? This is the symbol of the lotus. The lotus is a plant that lives underwater. It is nourished in the mud and the gook in the bottom, but then grows up to the top and comes at the top of the water and expresses this pure, beautiful, clean flower at the top. And again, if you want to think about this as being the unconscious, you know, muck and stuff, but what gets expressed is the sort of conscious mind up here. There's a similarity here. There's a similarity to this symbolism. And if you're a Jungian, and we're going to talk about Jung probably next time, we'll talk about, you know, this can be the shadow stuff, and then you have up on the top this, you know, the non-shadow stuff. But this is the ground of being here in the muck and the dirt, right? In other words, you know, you can't grow flowers without some shit, right? Shit's the fertilizer, right? So, you know, for the purity of the flower bloom in the open air, you need all this crap underneath, all this yuck, gook, right? That's similar to this Freudian idea. There's a little bit of a similarity there. They go together, okay? So again, this is one of the reasons, again, why I like to use Freud and Jung as a lens to understanding Asian thought, because there is this similar, even they're not talking about structures of the mind here, but there's a similar idea going on here. Now, one of my favorite quotes from Freud, and this is what Freud called the problem of civilization. He wrote about this in the book Civilization and Its Discontents. I highly recommend this book, very interesting. And Freud wrote about the problem of civilization. And he said, men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love, who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but that a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. The result is that their neighbor to them is not only a possible helper or sexual object, but also a temptation to them to gratify their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without recompense, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus, which means in Latin man is wolf or wolf man. Who has the courage to dispute it in the face of all the evidence in his own life and in history? And so Freud has a rather dim view of human beings. Thinks of human beings as wolves. This, I think, does a great disservice to wolves. We know a lot more about wolf behavior now and canid behavior. Wolves have much more of a structured environment than probably or lifestyle than we probably realized in Freud's time. But you get the idea here. Yes.
You relating to the views of how people see wolves?
Yes, absolutely. And again, if you take my 473 class, I'll talk about the history of wolves. For a lot of human history, wolves were really a scourge and were very, very dangerous. So this is what he is channeling here. He's not channeling real wolves. But just to let you guys know, real wolves are maybe not so bad as human beings, right? Real wolves aren't exploding their 5th nuclear weapon, you know, and threatening to send them over to places, right? Real wolves are running around in the woods and doing all sorts of things. By the way, the first native wolf pack in many, many years was sighted in Northern California recently. So wolves are coming back to California. Just saw that the other day. So, the problem of civilization. How can demands and desires of the individual be reconciled with those of the group? This is an interesting question. And one of the things that we're going to see throughout the semester is how Asian philosophy, Asian religions sort of deal with this question. Because this question is a question in all human societies. But Asian societies, Asian philosophies have come up with different ways that they deal with this question. How can the demands and desires of the individual be reconciled with those of the group? Okay, what's the relationship of a person to their society, to their culture? Freud links the discontent experienced by civilized human beings to the stages in psychic development of the child. We don't really need to worry about these, but these are basically similar as the developmental stages that the person goes through these kind of things, right? And you can see these stages in civilization, right? Beyond the purpose of this class to go into these, but here they are if you want them. You don't need to know those for the test or anything. More important, we can talk about eros being sublimated and this energy being put to more constructive purposes. Okay? And again, we can talk about this idea of sublimation, referring to the channeling of repressed energy to somewhere else. For Freud, civilization required the ability for people to sublimate negative, destructive energy into something constructive and positive. And he wrote, if civilization requires such sacrifices, not only of sexuality, but also of aggressive tendencies in mankind, we can better understand why it should be so hard for men to feel happy in it. Freud he is not a pleasant guy. He's somewhat misogynistic about people. Misogynistic, misanthropic, misogynistic about women, misanthropic about human beings in general. Why is he like this? Well, because when he wrote this is later in his life, he was suffering from jaw cancer. He smoked like 20 cigars a day, so he got jaw cancer, and they had to operate on him, and apparently for some reason, even though they had some primitive anesthesia at the time, some of these operations, they couldn't anesthetize him, so he'd have to be awake during these operations. You imagine having a jaw cancer operation and people are operating you without anesthesia. You might feel a little testy at the end of this, and not quite so. You might be a little grumpy. And so Freud became a little grumpy, and you can see some of this reflected in his writing. He has a very dim view of human beings, right? So the good news is we're able to sublimate, right? I can take all these aggressive sexual things, and I can sublimate and channel that energy into something more positive. But when I do that, I, as an individual, become a miserable human being because I don't ever get to satisfy my urges. So my choice is I can just do all these negative things and do all these bad things to people, or I can sublimate it and have a good civilization, but me as an individual, I can feel miserable. Right? This is what he said. So Freud's idea of how the individual relates to the culture at large follows along this line. And this is a pretty bad statement of the human condition. Human condition is pretty miserable. We're all pretty miserable because of this. So yes, you're all not fornicating right now and hitting and beating up and killing each other in here, and that's really good. That allows us all to have a nice college class for you to learn something, for you to get your degree, and that's really great. But because of that, you're all sitting here with your unmet urges, and they're making you feel miserable, and you just can't really truly be happy because you're just, you can't satisfy your urges, right? So what we do is we sublimate these things, and we tell ourselves that in the future, I'll be able to get these things, right? So you guys are sitting yourself now. I'm not having fun right now because I'm in college. I'm sitting through Vulcan's boring lecture on Freud, and I just want to get out of here and go have lunch, but I can't do that because I want to get my college degree. And if I get my college degree, I'll be able to go out and get a good job, and when I get a good job, I'm going to be able to go out and buy myself something that's going to make me feel really good, right? Because I have a good job. And so what you do is you put it into the future, right? So this is the way we fool ourselves into sublimating things, right? I don't get my jollies now, but I'm going to get them in the future, right? And so this goes back, again, your idea about Prometheus is very good, right? This is a Promethean idea. This is a hero myth idea. I'm not going to get it now. I'm going to fight with the monster, but later on I'm going to get the goods, right? I'm going to be a good person. I'm not going to submit to my urges now because those are sinful, but when I die, I get to go to heaven, right? You can see this is intertwined in our religion, our way that we are, and again, you'll find these same strains in Asian cultures as well. Okay. Yes.
This is it kind of sounds similar to like the marshmallow test with the kids. How if they wait and not eat the one marshmallow, they can get two later.
That's right. That's right. And some kids are able to do it right away, and some kids are not. And later on, most of them will be able to. They'll learn. This is the way to be, right? We learn to sublimate a little bit. There's some learning involved in there. It also has to do with developmental stages and these kind of things. But for Freud, this is why we're miserable. We can't have fun. We gotta Now, you could say our society is structured so that those people who sublimate better, put off their rewards until tomorrow, or the next day, or the next year, or whatever, do better in our society. And we certainly see that, for instance, in the educational system. The research is very clear that if you get a bachelor's degree, you will do better than people who do not have bachelor's degrees. There's been some questioning about this recently, but for the most part, the literature is pretty clear about this. You will make more money over your lifetime if you sublimate your urges right now. Instead of going out and getting drunk and fornicating and getting in fights, you're sitting in class learning stuff. You're getting a college degree. You're going to have, if we want to equate money and pleasure, which I think there's some little correlation there, you will do better in your lifetime. If you go on to get a master's and a doctoral degree, you'll do even better. So if you sublimate even longer, so you spend 4 years getting your degree here, then you spend another 4 years getting your PhD or your MD or whatever it might be, you're going to do even better, right? So even we see in the structure of our society, there is, we see this idea that sublimation, that you put off till later to get, the really the goodies, right? If you can do that, you'll tend to do better. Our society, we as a human society tend to like that. And that makes sense, right? We want to have a civilization. We don't want to have to I think collectively we don't want to have to deal with, is it nice to live in a safe place? I mean, you guys have seen the news about Syria and places like that. I mean, it'd be really miserable to be in Syria right now. People are attacking you all the time. ISIS will come and make you into a sex slave, if you're a woman. I mean, it would suck to be there, right? It's nicer to be here in Ventura County. I think most of you guys would agree with that, right? Well, we like civilization. There's something to be said for it. But as individuals, it makes us more miserable, according to Freud. Okay?
But it's a Promethean thing. So this neurotic idea of sublimation that Freud's talking about, to me, it's about, for instance, aggression.
Yeah.
Aggression isn't allowed in the culture at all. But as a martial artist, you understand that if someone was breaking into your house in a Promethean way, screw Zeus as the dominant culture, you can go ahead and attack the perpetrator and not feel guilty about the total repression of aggression. Now, 90% of the people will dial 911 because they're terrified. While someone's breaking in, they're going to hurt them. They will do the impotent, neurotic dial 911 because they're so afraid.
Yeah, I think that metaphor for me falls apart because you're still manifesting aggression. It's just you're going to get the cops to be aggressive for you. You're still being aggressive. You're still defending yourself. It's still the principle there. Yes, you're not doing it as an individual by yourself doing it, but even if you did do it as an individual by yourself, most states in the United States have laws that if you're protecting your house, you're allowed to be aggressive. That's actually codified into the law.
And then we'll take it outside of the context of the house.
Then it's not the same thing, Then it's not the same thing.
But now my principle now is still.
But if you look around, you'll see that kind of aggression everywhere. And this again, and this goes to Freud's thing that sublimation the mechanism is not very efficient. Doesn't really work very well. And again, just go to a bar at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? I tell people the story. Back when I was in grad school, my friend, she had an apartment downtown that overlooked the bar. And we'd go to her house at 2, right before 2 in the morning. We'd get a couple beers. We'd crack the window open, and the show would start. The bar would let out, people would come out, and immediately fights would break out. And the cops would park the paddy wagon at the end of the block and just wait for people to sort of soften each other up. And then once people had sort of had the initial beating each other up, and they kind of got tired, they'd walk in and they'd just pull the guys and throw them in the paddy wagon, take them to jail to cool off. It was like every night, It was like, so this stuff, we don't do this. So the idea, and this is one of the myths, by the way. This is a bill of goods that is sold to you by the dominant culture many times. Is that we perfectly sublimate things. Turn on daytime TV. Everybody looks very shiny and perfect, right? Everything. We have rules. We don't do. If you look at the society, as a whole, or you look at the whole world, we don't do this very well. I think we have spots and places where at certain times we do it better than other places. And one of the things that'd be great, if you want to go on and be a great psychohistorian, you want to be able to predict when bad things are going to be happening and get, be able to intervene, right? And we talked about this in the other class with reference to genocide. We're trying to study the stages of genocide so we can intervene. So one of the really worst instances of lack of sublimation, which is genocide, we can try to intervene and prevent that from happening. But we've done a really crappy job of it. There's genocide all over the place. Genocide is part of the human condition. It's horrible. But it's really, when you look at it, it's really out there. We don't do a good job of it. No matter what the society does, the dominant society, no matter how much we rail at Zeus for, wanting to, we still express our urges anyway. And again, if you look at Greek mythology, Zeus doesn't do a very good job of controlling human beings. He does a lot of retribution when they do bad things, but he doesn't do a good job of controlling them. right? And same way, in a way, our societies do not do, you know, I mean, again, right now, at this point in time, Ventura County, California, 2016, you know, here, maybe in Camarillo, doing a reasonably good job of it, right? You go to other parts of the county, maybe not so much. You go to other parts of the world, certainly things are not done the way. So this is a real variable idea. And so Freud tends to be very pessimistic, but you know, I have to say, I think there's a little truth in that. And I think you just have to look around and see what's going on anywhere in the world, and it verifies that truth to some degree. You know, now, I want to hopefully by the end of the semester introduce the idea that we can do some nice things too. Whether or not those are just impure sublimations or those are something that are maybe a little bit more enlightened, you guys will have to become the judge of that. Okay? Do Asian societies do this better than Western societies? I don't think so. I mean, you could look at China. It's got this rich history of all these wonderful Asian thought traditions of Buddhism, of Taoism, Confucianism, and you know they still have a lot of trouble. And you think about things like Confucianism, which arose out of a very chaotic time in China, the decline of the Zhou era, the beginning of the era of warring states when, you know, feudal lords were, little kingdoms were fighting each other all the time. There was lots of violence. Sublimation was breaking down. Confucianism and Taoism, to some degree, arise as a way to address those problems. And so one thing we can see is sometimes these Western systems of thought, these Western religions, these Asian systems of thought, these Asian religions, do arise sometimes in order to address, in my opinion, the problem of imperfect sublimation. Okay? And Confucianism and Taoism are a very clear example of that. Now, we probably could think of in the West examples of that. Well, we can think of the founding of our country, you know, the idea of, you know, America being founded as a democracy, as to address problems in previous societies where things weren't going so well. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Western stuff. I'm not an expert on political science. But I'm sure you guys could think of examples of that. But certainly in the East, we can find very clear examples of that. And we'll talk about those when we get to Taoism and Confucianism. We'll go into some detail about what the mechanisms that they came up with to try to help people get along better. Yes?
What's sublimation specifically?
Sublimation is where you take that psychic energy that you repressed, that eros and thanatos that's repressed, and you channel into something hopefully more positive and constructive.
And what's the difference from repression and suicide?
Repression is just pushing it down. Just, oh, I feel like I want to, you know, beat the crap out of somebody right now, but you know, no, I'm just going to just repress it and not do it. Okay, so the ego says no. If you do that, you know, you're going to be getting into trouble. And so, what is the result of doing that? Is that you feel anxious. Anxious. You know, Freud talked about signal anxiety, right? You know, you repress it, you feel anxious. And then whether the anxiety comes first before the repression and the anxiety, you can talk about that. Freud flip-flopped a little bit on that, but the idea that, you know, you repress stuff and you feel something makes you feel anxious, you repress it, you avoid it. Right? That's repression. But then taking that repressed energy and channeling into something more positive, that's sublimation. Okay? So it's an interesting idea. Okay? Now, if you wanted to poke holes in this idea of Freud's, yes. Of course there's going to be, it's not a perfect idea, right? Just like we don't manifest it perfectly. Okay? We don't manifest it perfectly. We're going to talk about, hopefully we'll get to it next week, we're going to talk a little bit about cycles of existence, cycles of reincarnation. And so, for instance, the Hindus is, well, you just keep going around and around and around. It just gets better and better and better. And eventually, it'll all resolve. We'll be able to sublimate perfectly. We'll all become enlightened, and things will be fine. And so the idea is whether it's the pebble in the river where you're just wearing it down eventually, or whether it's sort of Freud's idea where we're just going to live in this imperfect human world. It has a lot to do with also the way we conceive time, because we conceive time very linearly in the West, right? For Hindus, you know, they have a lot of patience because, well, things aren't good this time around, but next time around it's going to get a little bit better, right? So, again, we'll talk about that when we get to Hinduism. These conceptions of time, these cyclical conceptions of time, play into this. But for Westerners, for Freud, you know, we have a hard time with this. But if you're going to become a clinical psychologist, this is good for you because it means you will always have patients to come and see you. You will always have work, right? So if there's a silver lining on how miserable human beings are, it's that psychotherapists will always have work because of this, right? Okay, We can also talk about projection, where we project out our feelings and thoughts on someone or something else externally. We take whatever's bad of us and we project it on other people. That's another way we can get rid of some of these repressed energies. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about that in this class, but I will show you symbols where you can see, you know, repressed, especially repressed negative energy, repressed negative energy projected out onto, at least in a symbolic form, different things. And again, in a lot of Asian religions, a lot of this